was a brief outline of how you can think about dealing with pests, diseases, and garden fencing. Large to small, we'll start with some of the big pests, like white-tailed deer. There's no one perfect way to deal with white-tailed deer here in mid-Michigan, except maybe a very, very, very tall fence. As mentioned here in the first bullet point, 8-foot tall fence is not tall enough to keep a white-tailed deer out, but what I'm suggesting here is that you try to think more of a multi-pronged approach where you're trying to create an environment that is just irritating to the deer and where they won't want to deal with getting into your garden and they prefer to just not deal with that whole setup. So if you have a pretty tall fence with a wire strung along the top as outlined and shown here within this picture, that's one thing that you can do. You could also set up a secondary fence around the perimeter of this fence. That's called a dual perimeter fence. It'll be about 4 feet away from it. That would only need to be a few feet tall, maybe 3-4 feet tall. That can also be difficult for the deer to deal with because it messes with their depth perception and they tend not to want to jump over 2 fences at once. Also, kind of a similar vein to that, you can create little like micro enclosures. Say you have a smaller garden space. If it's not too large in there, the deer might not want to jump in because it would feel like it's not a large enough space for them to get out of. So another thing that you could do to simulate that by just other than just having a small garden is that you could kind of create a lot of small little pocket spaces within it by having trellises set up, maybe other lines and wires strung along the top of it. If you kind of make it like a spider web in there, the deer aren't going to want to get in there and get entangled in it. Other things that you can do with this multi-pronged approach would be to have a dog nearby, like this really cool dog pictured here, and maybe planting some perimeter plants around the outside, things that don't smell very good to the deer, like garlic, onions, or heavily scented herbs, that sort of thing. When thinking about pests that are a little bit smaller, like woodchucks and rabbits, they're not going to try to jump over your fence like deer, but they will try to burrow under it and dig some holes. So the best thing that you can do is to just get a fine mesh wire like what's outlined or what's shown here, or chicken wire. And you can either bury that underground within a trench like what's pictured here, or you could just lay that along the surface around the perimeter and maybe lay some landscape fabric under that initially so the grass doesn't just completely grow through it. But that's going to create a barrier so that when those smaller animals try to come and dig under, they're just going to hit something metal and then that will deter them. And besides having that mesh right along the ground, you're also going to want some fine mesh that goes at least a couple feet up as well around your entire fence. On to some of the smaller guys like bugs, one of the best things that you can do is to think about some of the general principles that have been covered in previous videos. So think about watering your plants really well, fertilizing them well. A healthy plant is going to have a much stronger immune response and won't be as palatable or as interesting to many insect pests, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, but that's the way that it works. Healthy plants actually ward off and fight off pests that might want to eat them. So just general good health, that's a great principle. Another very, very important one, and this might be the most important one, is regularly monitoring your plants. Again, in previous videos, I've talked about the best thing you can do for your garden is to get out there regularly, get out there every day if you can, and in so doing, observe your plants and see if you're noticing any bugs that are on there that don't look like good guys, or blotchy spots for diseases, that sort of thing. You just want to watch out. And in observing your plants over time, you can start to learn how to identify what's going on. Now, this presentation obviously isn't long enough to get into all the different diseases and pests that can happen for all the different plants, but I do just want to admonish you all to have a good guide by your side for identifying different plants, diseases, and insect pests. And then over time, over the years go on, you can learn how to deal with them. And you know, sometimes you might not be able to deal with the issue in that season, That's okay. You might just have to come up with a game plan for the following year on how to address those disease or pest issues. It's all just part of the learning process. Some other things that you can do is to plant a little bit extra, plant a buffer. So, if you only want 10 radishes, you could just kind of account for the fact that maybe not all your radishes are going to come through and just plant some extra. Other things you can do are companion planting. I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide as we talk about some of the different plant families and crop rotation. So crop rotation is pictured in that little map in the bottom left corner of this slide, where each of those arrows kind of represents how that one bed is going to be rotating to another bed, because you don't want to leave the same kinds of plants growing in the same growing bed year after year after year. It's going to be drawing kind of a different set of nutrients out of the soil, and particular insect pests might be inclined to go for a particular type of plant. So it's a good idea to move it into a different area so that they don't stay in the same spot every year. With that, it's really important to understand the different crop families. So you can see here that there's a number of different crop families, and there's more than what's even outlined here, but this kind of covers a lot of the main common and popular vegetables out there. So if you were rotating vegetables from one planting area or growing space to another, you wouldn't want to have something from the same family going in that same space year after year, to kind of per the point that I was talking about just a minute ago. So say you had a growing bed where you were growing broccoli one year, and then the next year you grow cabbage, and then the next year after that you grow cauliflower, and then the next year after that you grow collards and kale, and so on and so forth. You can see that within the cabbage family, all of those plants that I just listed off all belong to the cabbage family. So you wouldn't really be rotating anything different in the space, because they're all related to each other, and all those plants within that family share the same kind of disease and pest pressures. So it's better to rotate one set of crops from a particular family to a different space, and then make sure that you're mixing it up according to family. Similarly, with companion planting that I mentioned a minute ago, it's really great if you can mix things up with different families. So if you can grow a tomato plant next to a basil plant, that basil will have a beneficial relationship to the tomato plants that are growing nearby and can help deter certain pests. So it's great to just have diversity in that way with what's called companion planting. But I should note that not every plant likes to get along with each other, so if you're going to dive into the wonderful world of companion planting, you might want to look up more information online or find a good book on that. When it comes to diseases, here are again just some general principles for you to follow. So one of the great and important considerations is just thinking about airflow when you're considering diseases. So think about a good airflow, like hygiene for plants, so that you're preventing fungal diseases. So you need to be considering spacing your plants far enough apart so that air can kind of flow around them. What you want to envision is a healthy plant having space enough for all the leaves to dry out in any given day, so that the wind can kind of blow through them and clean off any dank, dark, wet spots that might be happening. So you can think about good air circulation like that. In a similar vein to that, trellising, staking, and pruning plants helps with just that, rather than having a plant kind of sprawl on the ground and be right next to the wet soil or mulch. If you can have the plants growing up lines like what's pictured here, that's going to make it so that the wind can blow through them and keep them nice and clean. When you do encounter something that looks like it's got some kind of a disease, then you want to remove that infected material. And then you also don't want to use whatever tool you just used to remove it on anything else, because that's now infected. So if you ever find yourself removing something, even if it's just your hands, you want to go and wash your hands, or you want to wash the knife or the clippers that you just used. We've already talked a little bit about crop rotation, so I won't cover that again. Some other general rules too are to not handle the plants when they're wet. Again, you got to think about moisture as a vector for disease. So in the morning, it's going to be wetter because you might have the morning dew. So it's best to try to avoid handling a lot of plants when they're wet and then going and spreading some of that disease from one plant to the next. Also, you can plant disease-resistant varieties. If you're looking at a seed catalog, a lot of times in the description of any given plant, it'll talk about kind of like a disease-resistant package that comes with it. So the more disease resistance it has, the better off you are. And similar to some of these previous points, if you minimize wounds on plants, that's also going to help because wounds are going to be an opening for disease to enter in. So just like I was saying, don't handle plants when they're wet. You also don't want to be wounding plants when they're wet. The best time to prune plants like tomatoes would be right in the middle of the day when it's hot, so that you can just kind of snap some of those branches off, and then the heat will kind of help seal off that wound much quicker than it would if it was cool and wet. And speaking of keeping plants up off the ground, I just wanted to give you some illustrations here of the diversity of things you can do for using for keeping things off the ground. There's no one right way to do this. So if you are growing anything that wants to grow upwards or would benefit from doing that, here's a short outline of some of what those plants could be. So there's plants like climbers, which would be like peas and pole beans, specifically pole beans, not bush beans, which just grow in a bush habit. But these are vegetables that simply need a vertical material near the plant, which they can then climb up on their own accord. So pole beans can be supported on something like a 3/4 inch bamboo stake and should not be given any stake thicker than this, or the vines will have trouble twining around them with their little tendrils. So some of those climbers, they can kind of find their way up with their miraculous tendrils that they just whip around things. Now that's different than sprawlers. These are vegetables which need vertical material near the plant, but they also need extra support by which we affix them to the trellis with something like a clip or some twine that we tie around gently. The common garden vegetables with this quality would be indeterminate tomatoes, cucumbers, vining melons, and winter squash if you wanted to get them up off the ground. You don't have to trellis all those, but you can if you want to. So you also need to think about whatever support you're using. Obviously, there's a diversity outlined here, but you will just want to make sure that it's going to be strong enough to hold up the bulk of the plant that you have. So a pea plant has a lot less weight than a tomato plant. So with a tomato plant, you might need a stake that's going to be at least about 2 inches by 2 inches in width and girth. So use lumber that's that size. Otherwise, it might not be strong enough to hold up the tomato plant.